Hi, I'm Joe Green. This year we're talking about what I think is the most important economic issue facing California, which is housing. Like maybe a few of you here, I'm a third generation Angelino. I grew up in Santa Monica. My parents grew up in Beverly Hills. And I've sort of seen the housing change myself in my lifetime. And remember when the Promenade opened in 1989 and downtown Santa Monica was this dumpy little area. And then they started building apartments and it became the first part of LA that actually had mixed use. And it became super expensive. And I had this moment recently where my childhood best friend David, who now lives in Boston, was back in town, and his mother has become an anti-housing activist in Santa Monica. And we were talking about it, and she's saying, there's too much traffic, I can't get anywhere. And David's like, well, where are people supposed to live? And she said, somewhere else. And he said, you realize that I literally can't afford to live here. Like, you are literally being an activist to keep your son from living in the city that he grew up in. And so here we are, and I'm really excited to have two very special guests. So Prophet Walker is also a native Angelino. He grew up in Watts, slightly different part of LA, and has a pretty incredible story of he's spent most of his career as a builder or developer. If you've been to the Ace Hotel in downtown LA, it's not falling down because of him. And he ran for state assembly back where he grew up in just a couple years ago, which is when we first connected. And we're now co-founders of Treehouse, which is a company building housing centered around community in Los Angeles. He also, when he was 16, he was tried and sentenced as an adult and spent 5.5 years in prison. And so had some pretty amazing experiences and touches on this issue, both as a community activist, as someone who's very politically active, and someone who's building innovative type of housing. And then we have Scott Wiener from San Francisco. Boo! He is a state senator representing San Francisco. I actually live in San Francisco now, and he's my state senator. He used to be my county supervisor, and he chairs the Housing Commission. He's written a number of bills, which you may have read about. And I have a lot of respect for Scott's kind of boldness and political courage. I think to many of us, housing is sort of the classic frustrating political issue. It's this problem that has a seemingly obvious answer: build more fucking housing. And yet, so few politicians have been willing to take it dead on. Scott had a bill he put forward last year, which was a very bold attempt to change housing and was not successful in the legislature, and he's at it trying again. So Scott, can you talk about what are the goals you've been trying to balance in putting forward housing legislation, and what makes the politics so very difficult?
So, hi everyone, thanks for having me. It's a tough issue because we often can't agree on the basic facts. It's one of those issues. It's a little bit like climate change has been, although that's trending in a better direction. And California has always been a place of opportunity where people come here and population grows and we do what it takes to make that work. And then somewhere along the way, probably about 30, 40 years ago, people decided, you know what, I love the California that I came here and when I came here to live, and I love my community. I don't want anything to change. And I don't want more people, and I don't want more cars, and I don't want more development, and I don't want to block the view. I don't want more kids in my child's public school class. And so people started opposing housing. And so, and because the state historically has allowed every city to decide locally whether or not to build any housing, it's a terrible system. We would never allow that for other important goals. We've accumulated a 3.5 million home deficit in California, which is equal to the deficit of the other 49 states combined. And so what we're trying to do is shift the narrative to get people to think about their children and about the future and about what California is supposed to be about, a place that changes and that's innovative, and to say, yeah, you may not want to have any change in your community, but if we don't start adding a lot more housing like yesterday, our economy is going to really suffer as workers have to live further and further from where they work. We're going to completely undermine our climate goals, because if you force people to live further and further away because you won't build housing where the jobs are, people have to drive and you increase carbon emissions, and we're going to hurt our diversity. We're going to push low-income, middle-class people out and young people out. And so we need to make some change.
So Prophet, you ran for office in Watts, and you see opposition to new housing, at least in two main areas. I think there's sort of kind of existing wealthy homeowners who don't want their neighborhood to change, but you also see it a lot in lower income communities that are worried about gentrification. And having come from Watts, can you tell us about kind of how what Scott is doing affects those communities and how we can kind of bring that together?
Yeah, for sure. So I see, when I think about housing, particularly connected to Treehouse, also it's how do we look at the larger reality of community and the erosion of connection between humans and society. And that to me is an issue both for the folks in Santa Monica, it's also an issue for folks in South LA. It cuts across. And what we've had sort of in Los Angeles is this experiment of this massive suburb. But what we didn't realize is that we were putting ourselves in these boxes. We'd get in a box in our garage, which was a box within our home, a box within our car. We'd drive to work, and then we'd get out of our box that's our car, and then get into our box that's our office. And we weren't interacting with one another. And through that lack of interaction, we've seen this massive social decline that's caused a lot of angst and depression, and the community has been fractured. And when I think about Scott's issue and the need for greater density in housing, it's fundamentally what we're trying to figure out with Treehouse. Treehouse, we're building these large-scale buildings that individuals are able to rent an individual bedroom and bathroom within a 5-person pod, and then actually connect and communicate throughout the building with these different nodes of interaction. And to Joe's question, when I think about this, why are people upset, are frustrated from a inner city standpoint as well as the NIMBY standpoint, there is a real fear of development pushing people out, rapid development pushing people out, but that fear cannot take root to the point that we actually do not build greater density, which is where Treehouse is trying to find that nexus there, I think.
So speaking of density and the way our communities are constructed, you go around Los Angeles and there's a lot of stuff that just makes no sense. Like if you go along the Exposition train line, you'll see single family homes. We've just spent billions of dollars building a train, and there's single family homes and warehouses along it. I know years ago, and LA was built as residential and commercial separate. You have these boulevards with one-story commercial. I think years ago they tried to upzone them, and then there was a ballot initiative that downzoned them again. So if you wanted to build new housing that doesn't displace anyone, that would be the obvious place to do it. And so you pointed to, and I wanted to ask a little bit more about it, you have this dynamic basically of planning is controlled very locally, which means it represents existing residents and not future residents. Right. And a lot of what your bills have tried to do is basically give the state more power. So how do you convince people to give up power that they have for the greater good?
Yeah, so it's about striking the right balance. If you think of our public schools, if I were to say I want to propose that individual school districts should have complete control to set what the rules are. They can decide how many days a year to teach, whether or not to teach math and science, whether or not to hire credentialed teachers. Local control is so important that the state should have no role in setting education standards. You would laugh me out of the room. And yeah, that's what we do with housing. And we have set up this system where the state has had little or no role. And that's what we're trying to change. And as one of the things that's happened because of that pure, unsustainable local control is you have zoning decisions, which are the fundamental building block for housing. Zoning is what housing is a question of, is housing legal in a certain area? And if so, what kind of housing? And we've allowed cities to zone in a way that either bans housing entirely in areas, or we see that in a large majority of California, if you take the whole landmass of California, a significant majority, all forms of housing are illegal except single-family homes. It's not about getting rid of single-family homes. It's about, should we allow types of housing like apartment buildings, like affordable housing, et cetera, other than single-family. And when we have, particularly in coastal California, in big swaths of LA, in a majority of San Francisco, all over where our job centers are, where public transportation infrastructure is, and we've said all you can do is build on any lot for one family. You can't, and that multi-unit is either illegal or maybe will allow you to do 2 units. And what that does is it just increases sprawl, it pushes people away, and makes sure that low-income, working-class people can't live there. And so what we're proposing on the bill that Joe referenced before is to override local zoning if you're near a job center or if you are close to public transportation. The bill would prohibit cities from limiting density. You have to allow multi-unit. You have to allow more people to live there so that we can have walkable communities, so that people can actually access public transit without having to drive, so that people, if they do have to drive, will at least live not 2 hours away from where they work, which is terrible for many reasons. It's a hard art. It can be a hard sell, but it's becoming easier. The conversation, the politics of housing in California have been shifting. 5 years ago, a bill like this would have been absolutely impossible. It's still hard, but more and more people understand that restrictive zoning is a huge impediment, and there's also an increasing understanding about the roots of restrictive zoning. Single-family home zoning was invented about 100 years ago. It was invented 1 year after the US Supreme Court struck down racial zoning as unconstitutional. So, okay, we can't zone by race anymore. So instead, we'll just say you can only build single family on, let's say, a 1/4 acre of land or 1/8 an acre, so that we can keep people we don't want. We can just price people out. It'll be impossible for people to actually live here. So people are seeing more and more the exclusionary nature of low density zoning. It keeps low-income people out, keeps communities of color out. It's just bad for many reasons.
Prophet, while Scott's been trying to change the laws, you've been trying to build within the existing laws. And when we were starting Treehouse, we had this vision for a different kind of housing experience. And pretty much every apartment building that gets built is the exact same apartment building. They look the same. They have studio 1, 2-bedroom apartments. And I feel lucky growing up in LA. I have a lot of great friends here, but a lot of people move here. They don't know anyone. It can be a very isolating place. I think in America, with this sort of epidemic of loneliness, you're seeing rising depression. A lot of that is about lack of social connection. And so, we went out trying to build a new type of housing, a totally new structure, and just basically ran into like a whole bunch of obstacles, zoning, finance, et cetera. So how have you sort of navigated through the existing legal landscape to try to do something different, and what might you want to see changed?
Yeah, for sure. So the point when we started off with Treehouse, one of the fundamental basis was we need to increase the amount of available living units within this given space. And if we could do that, the reason for that is for the resident, we would be able to do 2 things. One, we'd be able to create the most dynamic living experience ever, that people can actually have incredible intentional community. And the second, we can begin, certainly over time, to see prices that are not astronomically luxury, and we certainly weren't building affordable housing for the A, so we're focused on this sort of middle that was missing. And in doing that, we ran across, the first thing is this this idea of density and people renting by the bedroom just didn't exist in the zoning code. And so I had to work daily with the mayor's office and city council officers to tell them that, like, no, this isn't Airbnb, no, this isn't a short-term hotel that you're just gonna, people are gonna pop in and out. And then when you connect, once I finally got over the hurdle of convincing the city council that we were building something that had dignity, that was focused on this sort of middle, then I had to convince the bank and the lenders that that people would actually want to live this way, and they would rent in smaller spaces, because for so long, to the point of single-family housing, our mindset, and even in financial institutions, is that everyone wants as much space as possible, which I just do not think is true. People want to live incredibly comfortable and feel connected to the folks around them. So I had to convince a bank, and being able to, we talked to maybe close to 80 different lenders before we could get a traditional loan on this type of asset. And now you're seeing communal housing and co-living actually begin to roll a lot more. And your next biggest hurdle, frankly, is the building industry, which is the cost to build this stuff, to build housing at all in California and Los Angeles. You have prevailing wages that are really high. Scott and I were talking about this briefly, that prevailing wage construction workers are making the same amount of money to build a 80-story high-rise as well as a 4-story multifamily.
Do you want to say what prevailing wage is for people that don't know?
Prevailing wage is a union standard of wage for construction workers, and so it's typically about a third over what the market would pay to a construction worker, and that makes projects very, very difficult to pencil. And luckily for Treehouse, because we were able to create literally 2 times the amount of people living in the same space, we were able to pencil. But we're seeing right now a massive decline, and Scott may be able to talk to this, in actual multifamily being built in Los Angeles and San Francisco, predominantly because of the cost of doing business here. And so those were some of the hurdles that we had to get through, that hopefully.
Yeah, I remember as I'm used to raising venture capital money for software, which, as annoying as it can somehow be, is pretty easy. But Treehouse, we decided to take an approach of both managing buildings and actually building, developing, constructing them, and trying to talk to a traditional construction lending bank about no, people are going to live in this different way. And you realize this is why the same thing gets done over and over again, because the whole financial stack is wanting to do the same thing over and over again.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you wanted to touch on cost.
Yeah, I think the cost issue is real, but we know what needs to happen to resolve it. First of all, the carrying costs, when you have the land and you want to do something, you have the funding, but it takes you 2 or 3 or 5 years, or some communities even longer, 10 years, to get your project approved. That is a massive cost in terms of the carrying cost and not being able to get income from the land, but also consultants and community outreach and lawyers, and then the lawsuits. It really jacks up the cost. And so we've been trying to streamline housing approvals, just make it more ministerial, that if it's zoned for X and you propose X, you get the permit. You can do some design review, but none of this years and years of process. But the other piece is, in terms of wages, there is a very important conversation happening now. There was an article you may have seen in the LA Times a few days ago that the labor, the construction trades unions and the building industry have been negotiating to come up with what's called a residential wage, to say that the wage should be lower if you're building, say, a 4-story wood frame apartment building as opposed to a steel frame high-rise, and that will make the costs much more affordable and will expand the opportunity for more construction workers to get out of poverty wages into middle-class wages. So if that deal gets struck, and I'm optimistic that it will be, I think we'll see housing costs come down in terms of the construction costs.
And your point of the carry or the holding cost for a development project, if you think about it in percentage terms, before you even put a hammer to the building, which oftentimes you have to take the risk of figuring out with the city whether or not you can even build it, it's about 20 to 25% of your cost to build is on the front end of that. And so you look at a project, building a building ranges from 10 to $100 million. You can see how that's a very scary risk for anyone to take.
Well, and that's why there's some people who say, why is it only luxury housing being built? And of course, in terms of luxury, all housing is expensive now because we're not building enough of it, and 100-year-old units are expensive too. But when you make the process so incredibly expensive, then sometimes the only housing that pencils out is very high-end housing. Those developers can withstand a few years of process, they can pay the highest wages. And so we've set up a system where luxury, high-end housing is the most likely to pencil out. If we can make some reforms, we can spread that out.
So Scott, when you're talking to legislators here in Southern California, and you're basically saying, I want you to vote to take power away from your locality and give it to the state, how do they respond to that, and how do you and how can the people in this room help to persuade them that this is the way?
It's a mix. And I think, the interesting thing is, so in the Bay Area, we are probably 5 to 8 or 10 years ahead of LA in a bad way in terms of going down the housing crisis hole. We've been doing that in the Bay Area for a while. LA, has been catching up. So we're ahead of LA in not a good way. And so in the Bay Area, our legislative delegation, I think members are more used to thinking how do we do things differently. LA, there have not been as many members historically who have been in the legislature have been engaged in housing. That's changing. There are more and more Southern California legislators who are getting very, very engaged because they see the problems. And it's a challenging political. I thought Bay Area land use politics were the most difficult. LA is in some ways more difficult than the Bay Area. It's just a very complicated political terrain around land use and housing. And so it's been challenging for the members here, but we have some amazing legislators out of the LA area who are just becoming great leaders on housing. So I see positive things happen. And I think more and more people are understanding that this idea that we just ignore what the cities are doing, and if they don't want to build any housing, that's okay, that those days are over. And we saw the lawsuit that the state just filed against Huntington Beach, if you saw that in the paper, because Huntington Beach has been brazenly violating state law for years, and so the state is now suing, which is setting an example. Huntington Beach is not unique. I don't want to single them out, but you have to start somewhere. And for all the cities around the state that are ignoring state law, those days are over. And
because I was, I think a lot of people were surprised to learn this. The state sets targets for every city based on doing their fair share of housing. Like you see a lot of places like in the Bay Area, like on the peninsula, which will build lots of office buildings and no housing because they get revenue from office buildings. They don't have to provide schools. So how much power does the state actually have to enforce that?
So going back to the 60s and 70s and 80s, the state has set a few requirements. One, you have to adopt a housing element, which is like a housing plan, to plan for future growth. And there are 50 cities in California that haven't even done that. Huntington Beach is one of them. But then once you pass your housing element, you're given what's called our housing goals. It's called the Regional Housing Needs Assessment. Every 8 years, you get a number for market rate, moderate income, low income, very low income, saying over the next 8 years you're supposed to allow or build this much housing. We learned last year that 2/3 of California cities don't meet their housing goals in any income category, 2/3. And then the state, since the 1980s, has prohibited cities from stopping people to put people who want to put in-law units in their homes, secondary units, granny flats, accessory dwelling units. That's been illegal for cities to stop people from doing that for 35 years. But all of these laws were dead letters. It's been illegal for 35 years for cities to arbitrarily reject projects that are within zoning. It's been illegal. All dead letter is no teeth, unenforceable. So we've been putting teeth into these laws, and that's what this lawsuit came from. We authorized the Attorney General to file a lawsuit. We've been shutting the loopholes about how they prevent people from putting in-law units in. With the prohibition on arbitrarily denying projects, we have given people standing to file lawsuits and get attorney's fees from these cities if they arbitrarily deny projects. So we've been putting teeth in, causes a lot of tension, but it's an important direction.
So we're out of time. Thank you so much to Scott and to Prophet and Scott for flying down for the day to be with us and fighting the good fight.
Sweet.